Part 1. The station called Prime hung in the darkness between stars like a jewel made of light and metal. It was old, older than most civilizations remembered, and it held within its vast halls the collected knowledge of 1,000 species. Every discovery, every breakthrough, every small step forward in understanding the universe found its way here eventually. The Galactic Science Index was not just a library. It was a monument to what thinking beings could achieve when they worked together across the long centuries. Doctor had worked in the archives for nearly 40 years. Her species, lived for 3 centuries or more, so 40 years was not such a long time. Still, it was long enough to know every corner of the great database, every quirk of its ancient systems, every pattern in how species contributed to the sum of galactic knowledge. She had seen empires rise and fall in the data streams. She had watched young species make their first clumsy contributions and old ones fade into silence. Nothing surprised her anymore. Or so she thought. It began on a quiet morning, if morning meant anything on a station that orbited no sun. Was running a routine audit, checking the contribution metrics for species in the third spiral arm. It was boring work, the kind she usually gave to junior archivists, but she had been feeling restless lately and wanted something to occupy her hands while her mind wandered. The numbers scrolled past her screen in neat columns. They had added 600 papers on hyperspace mechanics this cycle, which was typical for them. The hegemony of had contributed their usual flood of medical research. The collective had submitted nothing at all, but they were in the middle of another civil war and had other concerns. Then she reached humanity. She paused. The numbers did not make sense. Humanity was a young species, barely 300 years into interstellar travel. They had only joined the galactic community 2 centuries ago, and most older species still treated them like children playing at being adults. Their population was small compared to the great empires. Their technology was borrowed more than invented. By every reasonable measure, their contribution to the index should have been modest. Instead, the number of credited discoveries attached to their name was enormous. Not the largest, certainly. The elder species had been accumulating knowledge but for a species so young, the count was absurd. Frowned and opened the detailed records. Perhaps there had been an error in the system. Perhaps some glitch had duplicated entries or assigned credits incorrectly. These things happened sometimes, though rarely. She began reading through the human contributions one by one. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Papers on stellar cartography, studies of alien biology, engineering reports on ship design, all perfectly ordinary. Then she noticed the pattern. Many of the human discoveries were not new technologies or exotic phenomena. They were principles, fundamental rules about how the universe worked, things that seemed so obvious once you read them that you wondered why no one had written them down before. She pulled up one example, the law of cascading thermal equilibrium in hyperspace. It described how heat dissipated in the strange space between dimensions, a problem every species with faster-than-light travel had to deal with. They had been building hyperdrives for 10,000 years. Their cooling systems were legendary in their complexity, vast networks of radiators and heat sinks that made their ships look like mechanical forests. But no one had ever written down why those systems worked the way they did. No one had formalized the underlying principle. The engineers knew instinctively how to build cooling systems that functioned because their teachers had taught them, and their teachers before them. The knowledge was passed down like a recipe, adjusted through trial and error over the centuries. Then humanity came along and asked a simple question. Why does heat behave this way in hyperspace? And when they could not find the answer in the index, they figured it out themselves and wrote it down. The paper was only 20 pages long. It had been submitted by a graduate student at a minor human university, and it had revolutionized hyperdrive design across 3 sectors, because once you understood the principle, you could optimize your systems in ways that intuition alone could never achieve. felt a strange chill run down her spine. She pulled up another example. The recursive symmetry principle in quantum biology. This one described a pattern in how living cells repaired damage at the quantum level. The hegemony of had the most advanced medical technology in the galaxy. Their cellular regeneration tanks could heal almost any wound, regrow lost limbs, even reverse some effects of aging. They had been refining this technology for 8,000 years. But again, no one had ever explained why it worked. The doctors knew which frequencies to use, which chemical baths to prepare, which sequences to follow. They knew because their ancestors had discovered these things through endless experimentation, and the knowledge had been preserved and passed down. The human paper was written by a biologist who had spent a year studying in space. She had asked her hosts to explain the theory behind their regeneration technology, and they had looked at her blankly. There was no theory. There was only practice. So she developed the theory herself. And once the principle was understood, it turned out that they had been operating their regeneration tanks at only 60% efficiency for 8,000 years. They had never realized because they had never asked the question. Sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Her hearts were beating faster than they should. She spent the next several hours going through human contributions, and the pattern only became clearer. Again and again, humanity had looked at technologies and practices that older species took for granted, asked the most basic possible questions, and discovered principles that should have been obvious. It was not that these discoveries were difficult. Any competent scientist could have made them. The mathematics was not complex. The experiments were not expensive. The answers were hiding in plain sight. But no one had looked. For thousands of years, no one had looked. Requested a meeting with the Index Review Council. This was not a small thing. The council was composed of representatives from the 12 eldest species in the galaxy, beings who had been studying the universe since before humanity's ancestors had climbed down from the trees. They did not appreciate having their time wasted. She presented her findings carefully, laying out the pattern she had discovered. She suggested that something unusual was happening, that perhaps the system needed to be reviewed, or that humanity was somehow gaming the credit system. The council listened politely, then they dismissed her concerns. "You are seeing coincidence where none exists," said Archon of the. His voice was deep and slow, like stones grinding together. "Humanity is a young species with young species enthusiasm. They write papers about things we learned long ago because they do not know we already understand them." "But you do not understand them," said. "That is my point. These principles were never in the index. I checked." "The index does not contain everything," said Speaker of the Hegemony. Her tone was patient but condescending. "Much knowledge is held in species archives, passed down through teaching lineages, preserved in ways that do not require formal documentation. We did not need to write these things down because we already knew them." "Did you, though?" pressed. "Your regeneration tanks operated at 60% efficiency for 8. If you truly understood the principle, why did you never optimize them?" There was a long silence. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "The young archivist makes an interesting observation," said coordinator of the, who was known for being more open-minded than most. "But interesting is not the same as significant. Perhaps we should study this pattern further before drawing conclusions." "There is nothing to study," Archon said firmly. "Humanity got lucky. They asked the right questions at the right time. It happens. It does not mean anything." The council voted to take no action, was thanked for her diligence, and sent back to her archives. But she could not let it go. In her quarters that night, she began building a private database, compiling every human discovery she could find, mapping the pattern in ways the council had refused to see. The more she looked, the more certain she became. This was not luck. This was something else entirely, something that made her question assumptions she had held her entire life. After 3 months of research, she made a decision. She would go to Earth herself and find out how humanity kept seeing what everyone else had overlooked. Part 2. The journey to Earth took 3 weeks by standard transport. Could have traveled faster on a diplomatic vessel, but she did not want to attract attention. She booked passage on a commercial liner under her personal name and spent the voyage reviewing her research and preparing her questions. Earth was smaller than she expected. Her own was nearly twice its size, and she had grown used to the vast scales of elder species territories. But what Earth lacked in size, it made up for in density. The planet teemed with life in a way that felt almost overwhelming. Forests and oceans and cities pressed against each other, and everywhere she looked there was movement, growth, change. She had arranged to meet a human scientist named Doctor. He was retired now, living in a region the humans called the Pacific Northwest, teaching at a small university that specialized in theoretical physics. His name had appeared on several of the papers she had studied, always in the acknowledgments rather than as primary author, thanked for his guidance and insight. When she arrived at his home, she found a modest building made of wood and glass, nestled among tall trees that dripped with rain. The human who answered the door was old by his species standards, with white hair and deep lines around his eyes. But those eyes were sharp and curious, and he smiled when he saw her. "Doctor, I presume," he said. Come in, you must be tired from your journey. Let me make you some tea." She followed him inside, ducking slightly to fit through the doorway. The interior was warm and cluttered with books and papers and strange artifacts that she assumed had personal significance. He guided her to a comfortable chair near a window that looked out over a garden gone wild with late summer growth. "I was surprised to receive your message," he said as he prepared the tea. "We do not get many visitors from the index. Most species seem to forget we exist until they need something." "I came because I found something strange in the archives," said. "A pattern I cannot explain. I hoped you might help me understand it." Raised an eyebrow as he handed her a cup of steaming liquid. The smell was unfamiliar but pleasant. "A pattern involving humanity, I assume, or you would not have traveled all this way." "Yes." She took a sip of the tea and found it surprisingly good. "Your species has accumulated an unusual number of credited discoveries for your age, not through volume of research, but through a specific type of contribution. You keep finding fundamental principles that older species somehow missed." Settled into a chair across from her and nodded slowly. "Ah, you noticed that. You do not seem surprised." "I am not. We have noticed it ourselves, though we try not to make too much noise about it. The elder species can be sensitive about such things." Leaned forward. "How do you do it? How do you keep finding things that civilizations with thousands of years of advancement somehow overlooked?" Was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the rain. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Let me ask you something first. How long has your species had interstellar travel?" "Approximately 12,000 years. "And in all that time, how much of your basic scientific knowledge has changed? Not the applications, not the technology, but the fundamental principles." Considered the question. "Very little, I suppose. The foundations were established long ago. We build upon them, but we do not often question them." "Exactly." Set down his cup. "Now imagine you are a species that only discovered fire 10,000 years ago, only learned to write 5,000 years ago, only built your first computer within living memory of your oldest citizens. Everything you know, you had to figure out from scratch. You had no ancient databases to inherit, no teaching lineages stretching back to the dawn of civilization. Every single piece of knowledge was hard-won." "I understand that," said. "But that should put you at a disadvantage, not give you an edge in discovery." "You would think so, would you not?" Smiled. "But consider what that history does to a culture. When nothing is given to you, you learn to question everything. You cannot assume that the way things are done is the right way, because you have no tradition to fall back on. Every generation has to justify its knowledge anew. He stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a worn volume with a faded cover. We have a saying on Earth. It comes from one of our philosophers. The only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. We take that seriously, perhaps more seriously than we should. We are constitutionally incapable of accepting it just works as an answer. Thought about the engineers with their cooling systems, the doctors with their regeneration tanks. They knew that their technology worked because it had worked for thousands of years. Why would they question it? Your older species, continued, built their foundations so long ago that they have forgotten they are standing on them. The knowledge became invisible like air. You do not think about air until you cannot breathe. You do not think about fundamental principles until something goes wrong, and even then, you are more likely to patch the problem than dig into its roots. But surely your scientists must reach the same point eventually, said. As your knowledge accumulates, will you not also stop questioning the basics? Perhaps, probably, even, returned to his chair. But we are not there yet. We are still young enough to be ignorant and ignorant enough to keep asking stupid questions. The kind of questions that more sophisticated minds would never bother with because the answers seem obvious. The answers are not obvious, said quietly. That is what I have learned from studying your contributions. The answers only seem obvious after someone has found them. Nodded. We have a name for this. We call it the philosophy of gaps. The idea that the most important truths are often hiding in the spaces between established knowledge, in the questions that no one thinks to ask because the answers feel self-evident. Your elder species have built magnificent structures of understanding, but those structures have gaps in their foundations that no one notices anymore. Thought about this for a long time. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the light was fading toward evening. When I presented my findings to the Index Council, she said finally, they dismissed me. They said humanity had simply gotten lucky. They could not accept that a species so young might see things they had missed. That does not surprise me either, said. It is difficult to admit that you have been wrong about something for 8,000 years, especially when the correction comes from someone you consider a child. But you are not wrong about everything. Your technology is borrowed. Your theoretical frameworks are adapted from older species. How can you presume to teach the galaxy about fundamental principles when you learned most of what you know from us? Laughed, a warm sound that filled the small room. We do not presume anything. We just keep asking questions. When we borrow technology, we ask how it works. When we learn frameworks, we ask why they are structured that way. Most of the time, we get perfectly good answers and move on. But sometimes we find a gap, a place where the answer should be but is not. And when we find a gap, we try to fill it. He leaned forward, his expression serious now. You want to know the real secret. It is not intelligence. It is not creativity. It is not even curiosity, though that helps. The real secret is that we have not been doing this long enough to know which questions are not worth asking. We do not know which gaps are supposed to remain unfilled, so we fill them anyway. Finished her tea and set the cup aside. Her mind was racing with implications, connections forming between ideas she had never linked before. I need to return to Prime, she said. I need to present this to the council again. They will not listen, warned. Not easily. You are asking them to question their own foundations, and that is the hardest thing for any mind to do. Then I will find a way to make them listen. She stood and rose with her. Thank you for your time, Doctor. You have helped me more than you know. He walked her to the door and paused with his hand on the frame. One more thing, Doctor, be careful how you frame this. Do not make it about human superiority. We are not smarter than the elder species. We are just differently blind. Someday our blindness will look just as strange to someone younger. The goal is not to prove who is better. The goal is to make the whole galaxy see more clearly. Nodded, I understand. She stepped out into the rain and began the journey home. Part 3. The council chamber on Prime was a vast circular room with tiered seating that rose toward a domed ceiling painted with stars. Representatives from the 12 eldest species sat in their traditional positions, arranged by the age of their civilizations from oldest to youngest. Even the youngest among them, the had been traveling between stars for nearly 15,000 years, stood in the center of the room, feeling very small. She had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, not just gathering evidence, though she had done that too, compiling an exhaustive database of human discoveries and their implications. More importantly, she had thought carefully about how to present her findings in a way that would not immediately provoke defensive rejection. "Thank you for granting me this second audience," she began. Her voice was steady, though her hearts were pounding. "I know I am asking for your valuable time, and I do not do so lightly." Archon of the stirred in his seat. "You were told that your concerns were unfounded. What makes you believe this meeting will end differently?" "New evidence," said, "and a new perspective, if you will permit me to explain." The council exchanged glances but did not object. She took this as permission to continue. 3 months ago, I presented data showing that humanity had accumulated an unusual number of credited discoveries for their age. You told me this was coincidence, or luck, or perhaps overeager young scientists claiming credit for things we already knew. I accepted your judgment and returned to my work. She touched a control panel, and a holographic display flickered to life above the chamber floor. It showed a sprawling network of connections, principles linked to technologies linked to species. But I could not stop thinking about it. So I traveled to Earth and spoke with human scientists. I asked them how they kept finding things that we had missed, and they gave me an answer that I believe deserves your consideration. "They told you they were smarter than us, no doubt," Speaker of the said dryly. "No, they told me they were ignorant." The chamber fell silent. Even Archon's perpetual expression of mild contempt flickered with surprise. "They explained that because they came to interstellar travel so recently, they had no ancient traditions to inherit. Every piece of knowledge had to be earned, questioned, tested from the ground up. This gave them a habit of asking questions that older species had long ago stopped asking because the answers seemed obvious." She gestured at the holographic display. "Consider this example, the law of cascading thermal equilibrium in hyperspace. Every species in this chamber uses this principle daily, even if they never named it. They built their cooling systems around it for 10,000 years, but no one ever wrote down why those systems worked. The knowledge was embedded in practice, passed down through apprenticeship and tradition, never formalized." She pulled up another section of the display. "Or this one, the recursive symmetry principle in quantum biology. They used this principle for 8 without understanding it. Their regeneration technology was operating at 60% efficiency because no one had ever examined the foundations." "We have heard all this before," Archon said. "What is your point?" "My point is not that humanity is superior. My point is that all of us, including the elder species, have gaps in our foundations. Knowledge that was discovered so long ago that we have forgotten it was ever discovered at all. Principles that became invisible because we stopped looking at them." She took a deep breath. "I am proposing that we formalize this insight, that we create a new division within the index, the Foundation Review Initiative, specifically tasked with examining basic assumptions across all fields of knowledge. And I am proposing that we staff this division with representatives from younger species, including humanity, who are not yet blinded by of tradition." The response was immediate and loud. Several council members began speaking at once, their voices overlapping in a mixture of outrage and disbelief. "You want children to audit our science," Archon's voice cut through the noise. "This is absurd." "Not audit," said firmly. "Question, there is a difference. An audit looks for errors. Questions look for gaps. Errors mean someone did something wrong. Gaps mean everyone did something incomplete. And you believe that young species with incomplete knowledge themselves can identify gaps that thousands of years of research have missed. Speaker shook her head. The arrogance is breathtaking. The arrogance, replied, is believing that because we have studied something for thousands of years, we must understand it completely. I have 17 examples prepared that prove otherwise. She brought up a new display. These are technologies currently in use across the galaxy. Each one is operating below optimal efficiency due to unexamined assumptions in their foundational principles. I have calculated the total economic cost of these inefficiencies. The number that appeared was enormous. Trillions of credits annually, year after year, for. This is not about pride, continued. This is not about which species is smarter or more advanced. This is about the simple fact that knowledge has blind spots, and the older the knowledge, the harder those blind spots are to see. We need fresh eyes. We need minds that do not yet know which questions are not supposed to be asked. Coordinator of the leaned forward. Even if we accept your premise, why would we give this responsibility to humanity specifically? There are other young species. Humanity is not the only species I would recommend, but they have demonstrated a particular talent for this kind of work. Their culture encourages questioning in ways that other young species do not always share. They are, as one of their scientists told me, constitutionally incapable of accepting that something just works without knowing why. The chamber was quiet now. The initial outrage had faded, replaced by something more thoughtful. Could see council members looking at the economic figures, running their own calculations. I will be blunt, she said. You can dismiss this proposal the way you dismissed my concerns 3 months ago. Nothing will change except that another human scientist will discover another obvious principle, and another, and another, and in 100 years you will be having this same conversation with my successor. Or you can take this opportunity to systematically improve the foundations of galactic knowledge. The choice is yours. She stepped back and waited. The vote was not immediate. The council debated for hours, breaking into small groups, consulting privately, reviewing the evidence she had presented. Twice she was called back to answer questions. 3 times she thought the proposal would be rejected outright. But in the end, the numbers won. The economic cost of inefficiency was too large to ignore. The pattern was too clear to dismiss. The Foundation Review Initiative was approved by a margin of 7-5. The following decade was difficult. Many elder species resisted the initiative's work, refusing to allow their traditions to be questioned by younger minds. Some breakthroughs were suppressed or ignored. Political battles raged in committees and review boards. But progress happened anyway. A team of human and researchers identified a flaw in the galaxy's standard equations for artificial gravity, improving efficiency by 12%. A mixed group from 4 young species questioned the basic assumptions of faster-than-light communication and discovered a way to reduce signal lag by nearly a third. An elderly engineer, inspired by the initiative's work, his own species' hyperspace calculations, and found 3 errors that had been replicated unchanged for 6,000 years. Slowly, grudgingly, the elder species began to see the value. Not all of them and not completely, but enough. The initiative grew. Its methods spread. A new culture began to take root, one that valued questioning as much as knowing. Humanity was granted a permanent seat on the Index Council, the youngest species ever to receive that honor. Not for their military strength, which was modest. Not for their economic power, which was still growing. But for something far rarer, their willingness to look at what everyone else took for granted and ask the simple question that no one else thought to ask. The Cosmic Science Index created a new category of contribution that year. They called it Foundational Rediscovery, and they credited humanity with pioneering the field. Years later, when the histories were written, A notation was added to humanity's file in the Great Archives. It read simply, "Specialists in the obvious." The elder species eventually admitted that this was meant as a compliment. It took them a while to understand that it was also true. And somewhere on Earth, in a modest house among tall trees, an old man read the news and smiled. He poured himself a cup of tea and looked out at the rain, thinking about all the questions that still remained to be asked. There would always be gaps, he knew. There would always be blind spots. The goal was never to find all the answers. The goal was to keep asking, to keep looking, to never assume that the obvious had been fully explored. Humanity was young, and that was their greatest strength. Someday they would be old too, and their own blind spots would grow invisible to them. But that was a problem for another generation. For now, there was still so much to discover. So many obvious things hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice them. The universe was vast and full of wonders, and the most profound truths were often the simplest ones. You just had to remember to ask.